So welcome everybody to another SEWAS Psychology online workshop. My name is Matt Yates and I'm here with my colleague Vicky James Perkins. So if you've seen our previous sessions, this is session number 3. So today's topic is attachment and our early blueprint.
So I guess to say, sorry, I was just going to remind people that our first session, we introduced the idea of self-care, but in a way that we understand it and what parents find helpful. And our second session, we looked at a little bit of theory about early development and how trauma impacts or interrupts that. And we've got our session 3.
Yeah. So today is about attachment and our early blueprint. So I guess I always find this a really interesting topic because particularly attachment. Now I don't know what you feel like, Vicky, but I often feel that just the word attachment isn't a very helpful word. Because I think people hear that and just kind of think, it basically just means if a kid's happy to come up and have a cooch, have a cuddle, that means that that's attachment and that's what we're focusing on. So I always like to just spend a bit of time talking about it in terms of what we actually mean by it, because it's such an important part of our work in adoption.
Yeah.
So what is attachment? So to start off with, I've got a quote here from John Bowlby. So he is probably one of the most, there's a few key people, but he's one of the most important people in terms of attachment theory. And there's this quote here from him from 1953. So responsiveness, availability, care, love and infancy are as important to mental health as vitamins are to physical health. So you hear that quote and probably now in 2020, that seems pretty like, well, yeah, that makes sense. But believe it or not, in 1953, this is actually quite a controversial statement. So at that time, they sort of felt that really all you needed to raise a kid was for them, as long as they were fed and watered, they had clothes on their back, that was probably it, job done. A baby or a child will make a relationship with their child and we're all good. But actually, what we now take as kind of perhaps the more sort of normal, more sort of common sense approach was actually quite controversial back in 1953.
And I think in our last workshop, we talked a little bit about how the neuroscience has really developed over the last decade to kind of evidence this theory that started so controversially years ago. Evidence, and of course those of you who are familiar with ACEs, this was just the start of capturing that sense of this bond between two people, a baby and a caregiver, is fundamental to our development, to our health, to our well-being.
So let's think firstly about the kind of things that babies do, and this will help us understand what attachment is. So the sort of things that babies do, Vic, is this fairly fair? They cry, they scream, they coo, but they also sort of giggle, they reach out with their hands, make baby noises. So Vic, when if a baby's crying, what is your instinct?
I guess an instinct for all of us, most of us, they are designed to draw you in, to be to get your attention, to bring you in with their eyes. Those are the kinds of just natural effects often that they cleverly draw on, and if perhaps the cutes doesn't work, they'll get loud. And as we know, babies can have pretty piercing cries that's pretty hard to ignore. There's lots of clever ways that they do it, even though they're tiny and can't talk and communicate in those ways. There's very clever non-verbal ways that they just do instinctively.
Yeah, absolutely. So all these things of, a baby cries, probably going to pick it up and help them stop cry. Baby screams, you're going to turn your head and you're going to go to them. A baby coos, you might even just sort of coo back at them and might even start having a nice little, almost like a baby conversation. When they giggle and they look cute, you just, it just often you can't help yourself but feel kind of enjoyment in that moment. When a baby puts their hand out, you might almost kind of instinctively give them a finger. And when you give baby a finger, they grab on, they latch onto your finger. And also, you can, when a baby makes noises, it's kind of the precursors to having a conversation. So you can totally have a baby conversation with the baby. There may not be any words, but you can kind of make some noises, and they'll make some noises back. You can actually have kind of the early stages of what will later be, conversation with words.
So they work really hard to get you in, don't they? To get adults around them to come close and notice and interact.
So yeah, as you were just saying, Vicky, so babies' behaviours, basically, they're all different ways of trying to get their needs met. So this is a really, really clever innate behaviour which helps them to survive. So if a baby feels that they're under threat, they can cry, and hopefully someone will come in and pick them up, make them safe. If they're hungry, they might cry, and someone might come along and feed them. If maybe their nappies are full, they will cry, and someone will come along and hopefully work it out and open it up and clean them up. So all these behaviours that we see in babies, they are about, as Vicky says, about drawing us in, helping us to get their needs met. So babies are super clever. They have this innate ability.
We're built to attach, aren't we, from the start? We're built to connect.
So what's really important then is sort of through this interaction, so through kind of doing things to help get their needs met, what then kind of happens with that caregiver, with that relationship, with that interaction. What the baby then starts to learn through that interaction is they learn about themselves, they learn about other people, and they also learn about the world more broadly. And like I said, all those things are through the relationship with the caregiver. Because in that moment, all that baby that has is that key caregiver. They essentially are their world. So no wonder they're making sense of themselves, other people in the world, just through that relationship with that caregiver. So therefore, how or if a baby's needs are met will have a really significant influence on how they understand and make sense of themselves, others, and the world.
And I guess those first early experiences, they're needing to very quickly lay the groundwork in their brain to adapt to the world that they're born into. So it makes sense of why in those researchers say that the first 3 years they've categorized are kind of essential in getting this kind of foundation set, which they can then go on to understand the world through. Which makes sense then about the examples that you're bringing, Matt.
Yeah. So often, more broadly, when people talk about these key features, so making sense of themselves, other people in the world, you can kind of think this as sort of statements. So generally, you can think of ideas about myself would be I am X, Y, Z, that other people are A, B, C, and that the world generally is X, Y, Z. So this is kind of what we kind of understand about that babies are starting to do. And it's really, really important to say that even though babies haven't got words, even though they haven't necessarily got key memories that they remember from their early experiences, it's their body and their brain and the neurology and the nervous system that are laying this down. So even though they perhaps couldn't put it into these words, it is there, it has been formed in the neuronal links in their brain.
So this is something psychologists call it the internal working model. That's not necessary, but we come to this a lot about how how children create that sense of themselves. And I guess I was just thinking about an example that where this is happening constantly through a baby's development. So if we just take a snapshot, a few little examples. So for example, if when a baby wakes up, let's say 6 months old, wakes up in the morning in their cot, the caregiver will come in. Mostly, we all have bad days, but mostly they're the first kind of experience they have of another is, good morning, hello, how are you? They have that sense of being discovered in a predictable way. It's mostly the same person or people that walk into that bedroom, that greet them with eyes, that say the same kind of tone of voice, the same greeting, the same pickup, the same comfort. So what that baby is kind of getting a sense of is every morning when I kind of come around, I'm enjoyed by it. You can just feel a sense of being enjoyable. other people, they're predictable, that I know that, and they obviously wouldn't be thinking this word, but there's just this sense of, I know this, I expect this,
Mm.
this comes, and a sense of, you're going to walk me now downstairs, we're going to go into that playroom. Again, they won't be thinking this, but the world is pretty safe. We do this, I sit in this high chair. So just those very small examples of a baby is constantly getting these messages through those experiences. Or, you know, before, as it comes to snack time or lunchtime, they'll have a sense of a caregiver noticing or checking their nappy, or and then how they're held along then to go into the next room and the next activity. So I guess these are things that are happening over and over and over, that just kind of starts to get logged in this little being's body as they're starting to develop and brain.
Yeah. And I guess it's really important to say that all the stuff we're talking about, so that lovely illustration that Vicky gave of kind of what it might be like for, you know, baby being woken up in the morning, it's important to say that no caregiver is perfect. So, you know, all this kind of stuff, these moments where a caregiver is attuned with their baby, this cannot happen 100% of the time. That is just not realistic. What we know actually is that roughly, as long as it's kind of you know, generally in sync for about 30% of the time, that's kind of what helps sort of form this more slightly healthier attachment. So it's more likely to be that baby yeah, is feeling kind of safe in that relationship.
And I think that's really important to say, Matt, because I think traditionally, or sometimes, attachment can be misunderstood as being attuned, sensitive all the time to every kind of internal state your baby has. That's absolutely not the case, and actually not healthy, not possible. So it's to say, for you know, for some of the time, this baby is experiencing that kind of feedback.
Mm. And I guess also another layer would be that the families that have adopted, it might well be that it's even harder to go anywhere near this 30%. So this is what we're talking about. This is kind of in the babies that have been able to have, you know, an okay enough start with the caregivers. If a baby hasn't received that, and they wonder later in life when perhaps another family goes on to adopt them, that they're kind of desperately trying to kind of get this sync with this child, but it's really hard. So we're again not even suggesting that an adopted parent would necessarily be able to get close to this 30%, because it's really hard.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, so big take home message there: we are aiming for good enough, not perfect. Okay. So what then therefore happens? So if a baby receives this what we're calling good enough care, they're much more likely to feel that there's I am statements. So I am lovable, I am liked, I am worthy, that others are reliable, trustworthy, caring, and that the world is safe, consistent, and predictable. So these bullet points we have here, we're not saying these are the definitive ones for each of these categories. They're just broadly big picture, generally sort of trends that we might see. So if this kind of this generally this 30% kind of generally in tunes, this sort of good enough care is taking place, it's much more likely that these are going to be what this internal working model, this I am, others are, and the world is going to be like.
And I guess it's just important to say that there's no such thing as like, you know, someone's experience of it just being like this. So for all of us, if we kind of think back to our own childhoods, some of us will have different traumas to a lesser or greater extent, but just that kind of overarching sense that there's that sense of kind of things being stable enough, others being reliable and reliant enough. So I guess just to hold that kind of reality around the good enough kind of sense, that generally you lived in the same house, or you had the same caregivers, or you went to the, of course you'll have changes in that, but just thinking back to how that fits for us in our own internal worlds.
And this is it. So we're just saying it's more likely that these will be the kind of things you would see, but absolutely each of us it's very likely we would have this in this lovely laid out manner. So, but also there are, you know, many examples that for lots of different reasons, caregivers don't or can't provide that good enough care. So perhaps reasons perhaps they don't would be maybe where a parent or caregiver has been abusive or neglectful. But actually also there could be lots and lots of reasons which aren't actually, you know, actively a parent not trying to parent. It could be maybe that themselves are experiencing domestic abuse. It could be maybe that they have some mental health difficulties. Maybe that ultimately just is a massive lack of support. They're just doing everything on their own. They're in a really difficult situation and it's just really, really hard. But also for all of us, what we often draw on is kind of the way that we were parented. So if maybe a parent or a caregiver themselves had a really, really tough start in life, and perhaps maybe their parents were abusive or neglectful, and maybe actually that's kind of all they've got to draw on in terms of when they themselves are parents. But also things like socioeconomic deprivation, a parent who's dealing with their own trauma, and maybe, for example, physical illness. So there's a huge variety of reasons as to things that might perhaps get in the way of an attachment relationship. And perhaps we're more familiar with the ones which are, like I say, more actively thinking about as abuse and neglect. But also there's lots of reasons which are not at all to do with a parent giver having any intention to not be able to parent their child. Just things that can make it really difficult. So we talked about what happens if a baby receives that more sort of good enough care. Here we've got kind of what might be a bit more likely if they weren't able to receive that. So instead, their I am statements might be more like, I am unlovable, unlikable, worthless. Others are generally unreliable, untrustworthy, or perhaps frightening, and that the world is dangerous, inconsistent, and predictable. So you can really see how, having that different experience can really mean that those internal working model that I am, others are, and the world is statements could be significantly more different. So we've got here our imaginary child. Sorry, Vic, go ahead.
No, go on, Matt, do this one.
Yeah, so basically just to say, so to imagine this boy here. So Vic, if you were to imagine that boy had the first instance of having the sort of more good enough care, and more likely to have those more positive things in their internal working model, what would be some of our guesses for how that baby, that toddler, that child will then go out into the world? How do you think that might go in a more better sense for that child?
Yeah, I'm guessing if this looks like he's in a park or going to a play group, you'd expect a child to at first be cautious, but generally you'd expect them to be quite relaxed, to take things in, start to engage, to presume that the adults around them are able to meet their needs, understand their needs. You just get it's a bit of a given, I'd imagine, for babies where that's only been their experience.
And
And
what
that's
about when
fun and it's, enjoyable, stimulating.
and then for that child then perhaps going into school and even kind of going to make relationships and even at entering adulthood, what would be some of our more guesses for how that child and adult may find those experiences?
I guess it would feel easier to make those transition, and like often children will feel a little bit understandably nervous or cautious going into something new, but a general belief or sense that, and it'll be all right, there'll be something fun here, will usually provide something interesting for me. If for that child got hurt or was struggling, my guess is that they'd have more faith, more kind of experience of letting someone know and expecting that would be made okay. Being able to tolerate sometimes when things were changing because the world's been safe enough.
Yeah, absolutely. So I really love that way you've described that, Vicky. And I guess conversely then, so let's imagine that this boy here didn't have that early experience, so perhaps he was much more likely to feel that I am worthless, I am unlovable, that others are untrustworthy and dangerous, and that the world is generally a frightening experience. What would be perhaps a different idea of how that child is going to experience life and connect or not connect with people in his life?
Well, I guess stepping in at first, just thinking about school or nursery, you would expect him to be much more cautious of others. He perhaps wouldn't have a sense that he would be worthy responding to anyway, so why show that you need something? Or conversely, not want to let other people out of sight because you might fear the world is too big and too hard. You might you might predict that other people won't be able to help you or be kind to you, aren't safe, that the world is too hard, is too frightening, so you might try and keep safe and not try too much there, keep yourself quiet or make yourself bigger and take yourself out of that. It's reminding me, Matt, then of the session that we did earlier on, fight, flight, freeze and the impact of trauma. But I guess the experience of stepping into the same school would be very different for a child who has this blueprint or this lens through which they have experienced the world through, and which they're going on to predict the world, versus a child who's had a much different experience of that and is bringing all of that with them.
Yeah.
So if that child were to fall over, they would perhaps just keep very quiet about it and not presume that their needs are important, or would not presume that someone can make that better or respond to them if they showed that they were vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess what we can see is how the reason why attachment is so important, has such a big impact on us, is basically just for the descriptions you gave, Vicky, I guess, really in the sense of, it has significant impact on how we're going to experience the world and the people in it and ourselves. So I really like this kind of analogy, really, of thinking of a stick of rock. So we really wanted to have a stick of rock, which was Blackpool rock. That's I think that's more traditional. Couldn't find an image of that, unfortunately. So we've got some Brighton rock. But the reason we kind of use this analogy is it's kind of saying how this internal working model, which we keep saying, which is just like the posh word really for the blueprint that's been laid down on us, is a bit like a stick of rock. Because if you cut a stick of rock in half, all the way through, you've got this writing, this word, and that really kind of illustrates how, and for all of us, we all have inside us these words, this internal working model, this blueprint that kind of runs through us. And it's there, and it's quite strong, and it's really, really heavily influenced by those early experiences in our life. And it influences how we see ourselves, how we see other people, we see the world. But it is important to say it isn't set in stone. It is hard to shift, particularly when we are at our most vulnerable, when we're stressed, when we're really struggling. We tend to often go back to our that blueprint that we all have. But if you think about how, if that sort of the blueprint has been formed through relational experiences, if you then go on to have different relational experiences, it can start to shift it. So maybe perhaps whilst a baby or child's early experiences where other people can't be trusted, there's no point in investing in relationships. It might be that maybe later on in life they go on to have a series of people who actually can be trustworthy and actually can help look after them. And that will just start to shift things. But it's just to say that it is hard to shift, and so often when we're at our most vulnerable, we do go back to our early experiences.
And I think particularly for adopted children, when children have been in their safe adoptive families for longer than they experience the trauma, that can feel tricky to appreciate, because they've had more time with you, so surely they should have grown safer by now. And I guess that just acknowledging why in those very first 3 years our brain develops at an enormous rate and sets down these, like you say, blueprint or sticker rock, something kind of gets set, so that it's very hard then to kind of shift it. And like you say, it does shift, but just to appreciate how important those first experiences are. And in some ways it was also making me think, Matt, about how we'll always have that kind of that written inside from those very early experiences, but what happens through those more reparative their experience in adoption is that life grows around it, so they're learning a different way to be in relationships. And of course that takes time, and sometimes they will always kind of trip back to those very early vulnerabilities, and so part of it is helping adoptive parents develop ways in which they can hold their children at those times and understand when those times happening.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so The final thing we wanted to show you was, excuse me, the circle security. So the circle security is a really fantastic program in helping to understand ourselves and relationships.
Mhm. And we've got a picture, a diagram here, and that's one of the main diagrams shared on the Circle of Security website that we find a really helpful way to think about attachment kind of in motion when it's alive every day.
Yeah, so it might feel a bit confusing kind of initially seeing this image. Excuse me, I'm still got a frog in my throat. There we go, that's better. This is the joys of doing a live recording.
Lots of COVID symptoms as well, Matt.
So hopefully this isn't confusing, but it's basically just a different way of thinking of attachment. And I've carried out this cybersecurity training and just think it's fantastic. So just to explain a bit more about kind of what we've got on the picture here. So on the left-hand side, we've got the hands there. That kind of represents the parent or the caregiver in a child's early experience, being kind of the hands on the circle that are giving that secure base and that safe haven. But what starts to happen is a child obviously wants to, or a baby wants to start actually exploring their environment. So they kind of go out into the world. So initially when a baby is young, it will just be a fleeting moment of looking over there and coming back to the parent caregiver. When they're 1.5, 2, it might be that they're happy to crawl over to a block on the ground over there, play with it for a bit, and then maybe they'll come back. When it's a toddler, maybe they'll be happy to go out to another room, do something for a little bit, and then come back. When it comes to school, they're able to go to school for the day, but then come back home to their parents at the end of the day. So all of this is kind of what we describe here, this idea of supporting exploration. So if basically a child goes out into the world and sees that whilst they're out in the world exploring it, that they are being watched over, that maybe they look behind their shoulder and their parent caregiver is still looking at them, they've got a great big smile on their face, maybe they're really excited and seeing what they're doing, but maybe also they're helping them, so maybe they're doing a task which they can't quite do on their own, but maybe the parent caregiver can sort of just do enough to scaffold it and help it, and ultimately to enjoy, to kind of do things with them together. This is also this idea of supporting exploration. So this is kind of going out on the circle. But ultimately, of course, at times, kids will need to come back in to their parents. So to come back in like this. And this will be sort of for two reasons, really. So for one of them, it might be that actually, do you know what, things go wrong, the kid falls over and hurts their knee, maybe they're frightened, maybe they're just unsure, and they really want to kind of come back into their safe pair of hands. And whilst they're there, they want to be, protected, to be comforted, to have someone to help organise their feelings, to help them make sense of, oh gosh, I think that noise frightened you, didn't it? Gosh, that was really scary. But similarly, also they could come back in, and actually instead, it's just they want to come back in, check in, have a nice little cuddle. They want the parent to delight them, to really enjoy their presence. So you can come in kind of feeling okay or not okay, but it doesn't really matter. And basically, this idea of this cybersecurity, this is just constantly going on and on and on, just going round and round and round the circle. And this is sort of what we would like to happen, the idea of this sort of this good enough parenting, this kind of good enough circumstances. But what we know is for many of the children who have gone on to be adopted, perhaps there might have been big disruptions in this circle. So a bit like how the disruptions in the internal working model, there's instead of disruptions in cybersecurity. So what that might be is, for example, perhaps a child wasn't able to go out and explore their environment because maybe they were just stuck in a high chair or something. Or maybe it might be that when they did go out into the world and they wanted to be watched over and delighted and helped, maybe the caregiver wasn't able to support that. So maybe they looked behind their shoulder and their caregiver wasn't watching them, wasn't interested in what they're doing. Maybe they were doing something which they found really, really difficult and no one was there to help them. Or maybe they looked behind their shoulder and their caregiver was actually looking really, really anxious and concerned. So this immediately means that this becomes much more tricky. The child feels less likely and confident and happy to go out and explore the world. Similarly, with the coming back in, if maybe when the child, the baby, the caregiver wanted to come back in, if the caregiver perhaps is very dismissive of their feelings, so just they were crying, they're like, oh, for goodness sake, stop crying, what's wrong with you? Or maybe they just completely ignored them, maybe they just weren't even there. This therefore means it's going to be much less more likely that the child is going to not want to come back in, because do you know what? When they come back in, the caregiver parent doesn't meet their needs, doesn't protect them, comfort them, delight in them, organise their feelings. So that's been a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but just demonstrating how another way of thinking of it is a circle of security, and you can really, it's a nice way of seeing how if there were difficulties, particularly in the top of the circle or the bottom of the circle, or maybe in fact even the parents' hands were on the circle at all, this can lead to that baby, that child going on to have really difficulties in terms of those attachment relationships.
And I know in our next video we'll go on to kind of break this down a little bit more, but just broadly, as for parents who are new to this diagram, just having a think about what you know, obviously from records, what might your child's experience have been of being protected or comforted? How many hands did your child have, whether that was a number of people in the birth home or foster placements, respite, just getting a sense about what might that have been like for my child. And similarly, often in adoption, kids don't get adopted lightly, as you know. So neglect would be a child stuck out in that world in very small and big ways. So being out in that world far too long on their own in too many important ways. So sometimes just kind of having a little think about, and a child perhaps who won't leave a safe pair of hands is often a child who those hands aren't consistent, so they can't trust that they'll be there if they go out and play, so they got to keep close to them. So it's just a starting point really to think about what your child's experience has been, what their pattern tends to be with you now. Can be helpful to kind of track what their next needs are and kind of developing their attachment and safety with you, or continuing to develop it.
So if you are sitting there thinking, hang on a second, this just seems really confusing, it's yet another way of thinking of it. It is very much the same idea as what we were talking about before, but it's something that Vicky and I really like and draw on quite frequently, that a really nice way of thinking about attachment. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that brings us to the end of this session. So we hope you found it useful, and we will be shortly bringing you the next session soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.